Texas and Jersey, everywhere joining us today. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. We are so excited to have Dr. Bruce Perry with us this afternoon, where I am in Chicago. Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Merrick. I am the president and CEO of Prevent Child Abuse America, and I am just so thrilled that you have taken time out to be with us to talk with Dr. Perry about this incredible book, this incredible journey. We are going to do a lot of fun things, I hope, in the next hour and a half, 2 hours or so. We are going to have a conversation. We are going to hear some audio clips from the audio book. So Miss Oprah Winfrey will be with us in voice, and I love it. I'm loving listening to the audio book when I fall asleep at night. Not that it's a boring book, but I've already read it. And now I listen to it, and there's just something so filling about hearing these voices, telling these stories, and just the power of, what's happening. So anyway, we want to get to it. I want to first acknowledge that we have enabled closed captioning. So if Olivia from my team is going to put it on here, you just have to accept it if you want to read along and have the closed captioning. So you should see that. And so I'll pause here for a moment for that. And also to share that Dr. Perry has graciously agreed to be recorded, and all of you have agreed by staying on to be recorded here. But we're not going to be looking at the chat for questions. We had over 100 questions come in for Dr. Perry, and for this time together. Obviously, I hope you'll understand we will probably not get to all of those questions, although I do have many of them here to pose to Dr. Perry for his reactions. But really, we want to have a conversation. We want to have a conversation together about healing, about being brain aware, about having empathy for one another, the role that we all have to play in preventing childhood adversity, in achieving health and well-being and prosperity, just all these things. So I hope that you will join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Perry, who I have just gotten to know over the last several years. Obviously, like many of you, I was a big fan of his work. I was probably not what you would call a super fan, because I don't have a shirt with his face on it that I wear to conferences. And I don't have a Bruce Perry fan club, although I would like to join all of the many of your fan clubs that you have, that I know he loves at every meeting when you all show up with those shirts. So but I met Bruce Perry in March of 2019 at a Prevent Child Abuse North Carolina meeting, where we were both speaking, and we shared a lift to the airport, and our flights got delayed. And anyway, as they say, the rest is history. Just getting to know this great scholar and this great man, also this amazing champion for children and families, has been one of the great honors of my life. And he's also the vice chair of our national board of directors here at Prevent Child Abuse America. So in all of the many roles and relationships that we have, friend, mentor, just champion, I'm just so ecstatic that you're with us, Dr. Perry. So welcome.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to be here. As you know, I would do anything for you. Now you call me Dr. Perry, and it just makes me smirk when you say that, because I usually, she calls me Bruce, which is just fine. Bruce let's go with Bruce.
All right.
Dr. Merrick.
Well, let's go with Melissa. Melissa and
right.
Bruce having a conversation about your tremendous book. So first, please, for those, I think, during the registration process, we have, a bunch of people, of course, who've read it and reread it many times. We have some that are still reading, and we have some that are here to learn, and to hear what the book is about, and to see if it could add value to their lives, to their relationships, professional and personal. So I'd like to give you a couple minutes, Bruce, to describe, briefly kind of what inspired you to write this book. How did you come to write this book with Oprah Winfrey? And really what you hope that people will get out of this book.
I actually feel very lucky to have had that opportunity to write something with Oprah. I think everybody knows anything that Oprah kind of gets connected to has a tremendous reach, and people, I heard a story once that if she mentioned on her show that she liked a certain kind of chapstick or something, that that the valuation of the company went up 3 times. It was so. Has a tremendous impact, and it's interesting because I've known Oprah for 30 years, and I met her many years ago in Chicago. And over the year, I mean, she was famous then, but she's become much more famous. And but over the years, we've had many opportunities to have conversations about trauma and about a lot of other things. But I've worked with her on a couple of projects. One of the biggest is her school in South Africa, which we can talk about a little bit maybe later on. But so over the years, I got to know Oprah really well. And after she stopped doing her show, she had an opportunity to be a correspondent for 60 Minutes episodically. And so she read an article in the paper about Milwaukee. And she decided that she's spent part of her life in Milwaukee, has some family in Milwaukee, decided she wanted to do a story about trauma in Milwaukee. And so she went and started talking to people. And one of the organizations she talked to in Milwaukee said, "Oh yeah, we're using Bruce Perry's model." And she says, "Wait, you know Bruce Perry?" And so she called me up and said, "Do you know about what these people are doing?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, will you be on the 60 Minutes show?" And I'm like, I guess, okay. So for those of you who have never done this media stuff, it's a really weird kind of double-edged sword, because it's kind of seductive on one hand. You think, oh, how flattering. But it's so intrusive. They follow you around for a day, and then you fly someplace and you do an hour interview or 2-hour interview, and 2 minutes are used on the show, But anyway, it's so after the show aired, her publisher, Oprah has a relationship with Flatiron Press, which is an imprint of Macmillan. And she features, certain kinds of authors. And the Bob Miller, the publisher, said to Oprah, "Would you ask Bruce if he wants to write a book about this trauma stuff?" And so she called me and said, "Listen, I don't want to put any pressure on you, but Bob Miller wants you to write a book about trauma." And I said, "I already wrote a book about trauma." I said, and I said, "You know what, though? If we write a book together, we're going to reach a much bigger audience." And she said, "I don't know. She says, I don't want to write a book." I said, "Oh, yeah, I'll have to just sit down and record some of our conversations." And then we talked about it, and that's what we decided to do. So I went to her ranch in Hawaii for 4 days, and we sat down on her porch, and they videotaped us and audio recorded us talking, and made piles and piles and piles of transcripts. And I started working on those, and took a couple of years to kind of put it together, but that became the book.
It's amazing. It's, unlike any other book about trauma that I've read, right? I mean, we read these books and these white papers, and, certainly the scientific literature. And of course, that's really important and impactful. But a book like this, and especially why I love the audiobook, is because it's really sharing conversations, right? And we all know, I mean, I know that the 900 people that are joining live and, the 2,000 people that registered for this event, we know something about building relationships. We know something about trauma, but to hear, how things get crystallized and these stories of, your journey, and Oprah's journey, right? And learning more and in becoming more brain aware. It's really pretty profound and really remarkable. So first, like on behalf of everybody that's joining, I just want to thank you for writing another book about trauma. But this book is just, I think it has really the power of just reaching people, right? And taking hold in a way that, I mean, granted, I have kids and a job and a pandemic, and like all of us, don't have any time to read. So, but to hear in conversation, it's like you're just drawn to the content. And so, with that said, we have 4 excerpts from the audiobook that we are going to play just to let people know how we're going to try to roll the next couple hours together. We're going to play one and then, ask Bruce to react to it and share anything. And then I'm going to look at some of these hundreds of questions that came in by topic. I've done some pre-homework about it. So I think we have some great questions that hopefully, again, will spark some conversation and some deeper kind of diving into some of these elements. So does that sound good with you, Bruce?
Awesome.
Awesome. Good. So Olivia, if you would play the first clip, please.
Dr. Perry has helped open my eyes to the ways in which powerful, frightening, or isolating sensory experiences that last mere seconds or are endured for years can remain locked deep in the brain. Yet, as our brains develop, constantly absorbing new experiences while continuing to make sense of the world around us, every moment builds upon all the moments that came before. I've always felt the truth of the saying that the acorn contains the oak. And through my work with Dr. Perry, I know this to be true, too. If we want to understand the oak, it's back to the acorn we must go. Oprah.
Early in our relationship, I remember Oprah saying, "You're the guy who sees everything through the lens of the brain. Do you think about the brain all the time?" The short answer is, almost. I think about the brain a lot. I was trained as a neuroscientist, and I've been studying the brain and stress response systems since I was in college. I'm also a psychiatrist, a field I pursued after my training in the neurosciences. I found that a brain-aware perspective helps me when I'm trying to understand people. Being a child psychiatrist, I'm often asked about troubling behaviors. Why is that child acting like a baby? Can't he act his age? How could a mother stand by and watch her boyfriend beat her child? Why would someone ever abuse a child? What is wrong with that child, that mother, that boyfriend? Over the years, I've found that seemingly senseless behavior makes sense once you look at what is behind it. And since the brain is the part of us that allows us to think, feel, and act, whenever I'm trying to understand someone, I wonder about that person's brain. Why did they do that? What would make them act that way? Something happened that influenced how their brain works.
Wow. First, Bruce, how is it to hear yourself?
I was going to say, do I really sound like that? Do I really talk that slowly?
You enunciated very well. So
yes, because I had to do it like 4 or 5 times.
Yeah, but I'm really struck, by first Oprah. First of all, I'm so thankful that Oprah could be with us in this conversation too, through her voice and just, the power of her, really putting it all together, that every moment builds upon all the moments that come before. And certainly we know that thanks in large part to your work and lots of neuroscientists' work about brain development and such. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about brain development.
Well, one of the things that I learned early on when I was becoming a neuroscientist was that the field's remarkably complex and exploding in the exploration process. There's a lot of different ways to track it. You can look at the number of journal articles published, you can look at all kinds of other things, but I just remember going to the Society for Neuroscience meetings when I was a trainee, and then 20 years later going again, and it was just a completely different experience. So one of the things I learned early on is that the variable that's so important in the developmental neurosciences and actually developmental psychology and really historical perspectives on anything is that there are trajectories and to the present, and that you can get to the present point through multiple trajectories. And however, if you try to understand something in the present moment without understanding where it's come from and the trajectory to the present, you're not going to be able to be very good at predicting where things will go. And so you're kind of in it's like trying to understand something in a fog. But if you understand the trajectory, you're much better at predicting the momentum and the direction that will take you out of this moment. And so I've just become very, very appreciative of the power of looking back and looking at the antecedent occurrences that lead to the present moment. Now, the other thing you learn that's very interesting, and this is very powerful, is that you can see in a given, either in a person's life or in a given developmental process, these amazing inflection points that because of the tiniest little thing that happens, the trajectory changes. But what happens is because it changes, you can never get back and go a whole direction that you could have gone if you had had a different inflection experience. So I think, for example, I give the example a lot of times of a kid I knew who was, and I'm not proud of this, but probably like a lot of people when I was younger, there were times when I got drunk and did something stupid. But most of the stupid things I did just, got me dirty or got me puked on or, something like that. But there was a kid I knew who got in a car and drove a car and killed somebody in the car accident. And from that moment forward, that inflection experience where, there for the grace of God go I, right? I mean, I'd probably done stupid things, but that literally led to this spiral of self-loathing and deterioration. And he ultimately committed suicide. And I think development is like that. Development has these interesting phenomenon that we need to know more about. And more than anything, I think what learning about development has taught me is that we shouldn't be so imperial or patronizing about interpreting the present moment or the way a person is functioning right now, without understanding how they've gotten to this point. Yeah. And I think that the tendency in so many of our systems and so many of our models we have to try to understand human behavior are striving towards simplicity rather than embracing the complexity.
Yeah.
So even when we do research studies, right? we'll do a study to see the effectiveness of a medication. But what we'll do is we'll exclude all the people that are struggling with drug abuse. We'll exclude all the people who have parents that can't bring them into the clinic. We'll exclude all the people who are have other comorbid problems. So then we get an outcome from a study that studied a very small homogeneous population, but it has very little relevance to the real problems that most people bring in packages.
Right.
And so I think that developmental perspective always makes me think a lot about and embrace the complexities of human beings and the messiness of trying to understand how things work.
Absolutely. I mean, the complexity, and, in a research article, we say, oh, it's a limitation. We, didn't study the confounds, right? Or the confounding variables or the context, but we're increasingly in this moment of being alive during a global pandemic, during a moment of acute racial and civil unrest, we're not able to ignore that context matters. And that is super complex. So you layer that on to the sort of typical complexities, and it's quite a lot. But because of these inflection points, as some people are putting into the chat, they're subtle, but they can be so impactful. But to me, it also brings a lot of hope to this area, because we have all these moments to do good stuff and to change those trajectories. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like the building that is required for brain development and life and well-being, but how we always have an opportunity.
See, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the most powerful things that we do as if you do therapeutic work, or if you're a teacher, or if you're a parent, one of the most powerful things you can do is be fully present in a moment and be truly trying to understand, trying to connect, trying to share your love, or share, in an effort to understand somebody. And because these moments themselves can become inflection points. See, one of the great things about the human brain is its capacity to store experience. So, a major important part of our brain is the top part, the cortex, and the cortex is able to sort of remember things, sometimes not accurately, but you can remember things. And so, if you're a little child and some adult interacts with you in a truly sincere way, where you feel like you're really seen and you're really valued, your cortex can store that in a way that you can revisit that even when that person is gone. And so in that very brief, meaningful, but true moment, an adult can provide an inflection point for a child to move down a hopeful trajectory, as opposed to a trajectory that looks around the reality that there's hardly anybody in my life, hardly anybody cares for me. I'm invisible. I'm not the right color. I'm not smart enough. I'm not a good enough athlete. I get marginalized at lunch. But you know what? That guy thought I was awesome at whatever. And that can keep kids on a healthy trajectory. And I think that this is something that we underestimate in therapy. This is something that we underestimate as a teacher, as a coach. And this is linked to something that I think is so important that we talk about a lot, is sort of relational poverty. You're not going to get, there aren't going to be opportunities for people to give you these incredibly powerful and important inflective interactions if they're not there.
Right.
I mean, if you just walk home all by yourself and sit on your couch and turn on TV, which is what some kids are forced to do because their parents are out working their butts off to keep them in this apartment and get food on the table. And so our society is sort of, something that this is what you were talking about earlier, Melissa, this context. We need to understand the relational context that has been created by, colonizing practices, capitalistic practices, other choices that sort of have been made in the history of our society that bring us to this point where we can have large populations of kids who don't have enough people around to reflect good things back to them.
Right. Gosh, I love talking to you. And I know people love hearing from you, because what I hear in those words, as I put, of course, my brain is always thinking prevention, prevention, prevention. What I hear you saying is that we need to be supporting policies that help families, parents, community members be able to be more present, to really impact lifelong health and intergenerational health and well-being. Is that fair? Yeah,
absolutely. It's 100%. In a very meaningful way, high quality urban planning that puts people in the same space is as important a prevention program as something that would be more conventionally viewed as a prevention program, like a home visiting program, which I love. But I also think it's important that that same family that has a home visitor can walk out into a beautiful park and sit on a park bench next to a person who will start talking with them while their children can play with some other kids in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
That density of relational connection is really what creates health in a community.
Yeah. Oh, this is really powerful stuff. Let me look to some of the audience questions. Ida and Kelly kind of sent in the same question around, can the brain completely heal from an emotional or physical abuse or trauma to the point that you no longer feel the effects? Tell us about that.
Well, now here comes my developmental complexity answer. So a lot of people, when they have the concept of heal, you have it in your mind that you get like an infection. Mm-hmm. And then you take a medicine or you have a process where all of the bad stuff is gone, and then the healthy skin can grow over, and that little bee sting or whatever that is healed. It's back to the way it was.
Yeah.
The brain doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. The brain is but now be hopeful. Yeah. What the brain can do is, when experience alters the systems in the brain and that compromises function, the brain has the ability to essentially build around or rebuild those networks so that you can restore function. Mm-hmm. So you can get back to or get to where you should be, but you'll still have some remnants or residue of that previous experience. Right. So, which may not actually be a bad thing. Right. One of the things that we're learning more and more about is, different people have referred to either post-traumatic growth or post-traumatic wisdom. That the reality is many things that are hard are ultimately things that can create beauty.
Sure.
When you think about art, think about some of the most beautiful art emerges from the pain of the artist. And that gives to so many people.
Yeah.
Whether it's a novel or a play or a film or a painting, you very rarely find a moving piece of art that has not got a healthy portion of pain that's part of that. And that's, there's something that's kind of beautiful about that.
Tremendously beautiful. I have to share, for those who are in Chicago at the Art Institute, there's this beautiful exhibit that's open until Monday. That it was my first trip with my kids and my husband to the Art Institute last weekend. Bisa Butler, she does these tremendous quilts. And she's married to a DJ herself. So he has a playlist that accompanies each of these pieces, but it is so tremendously impactful. But when you say beauty comes from pain, I mean, there's no other way to describe this exhibit, which really was the most powerful exhibit I've ever seen in my life. So if you're in Chicago, please, you still have time to go to the Bisa Butler exhibit, but also online you can find it, and the playlist that accompanies each of the pieces, you can watch it, but it's just really tremendous. Okay, back to the current conversation is, but that really resonates with me because I think you're absolutely right. And I have not heard, of course, anyone describe brain development in that way, but I think that that really captures it. There's really a lot of people we do hear, that say it's because of their early adversity or it's because of their trauma that they are who they are, right? When we talk to professional athletes, they don't think that they want to erase, the trauma that they've experienced. They think it's made them stronger or better or, really emanated in some beauty and power. So with that, though, I would like to ask Olivia to play the second clip because this gets into the timing piece, and we had a lot of interest in this finding. So Olivia, if you could play the next clip.
The basic finding is that the experiences of the first 2 months of life have a disproportionately important impact on your long-term health and development. This has to do with the remarkably rapid growth of the brain early in life and the organization of those all-important core regulatory networks. If, in the first 2 months of life, a child experienced high adversity with minimal relational buffering, but was then put into a healthier environment for the next 12 years, their outcomes were worse than the outcomes of children who had low adversity and healthy relational connection in the first 2 months of life, but then spent the next 12 years with high adversity. Think of that. The child who has only 2 months of really bad experiences does worse than the child with almost 12 years of bad experiences, all because of the timing of the experience.
This is such an incredible finding. I'm seeing in the chat that people had to re-listen to this segment of the book a couple times to really make sure that they understood. And I'll say that Bruce has even shared this with our board, and they, the finding is so compelling because I think it speaks to a lot of what we want in Healthy Families America and in home visitation programs. We want to support new families, new parents on the birth of a child to really make sure that critical period is the strongest and healthiest and most interactive component. Yet we also know that time coincides with the highest risk of child abuse and neglect, right? The itty bitty under 1-year-olds for sure, and smaller kids are at risk for violence. So sometimes I hear this finding and people find it, oh my gosh, like, well, what if we don't get it right in the first 2 months? So tell me a little bit more about this finding and really how you see its connection to what we do no matter when we encounter a young person, whether they've been in trauma or not.
Right. Well, first of all, let me say, I'll put the reference in the chat so people can see it. And we've actually replicated this a couple times. So here's a little science. So as I write about in the book, one of the things, if you envision the brain as this upside down triangle, with the top the cortex, the bottom is the brainstem. We know that we have these really important regulatory networks that originate in lower parts of the brain, and then they send connections up into every other part of the brain and out into the body. So early in life, one of the major roles that these systems play is to send organizing signals to undeveloped parts of the brain. So at birth, you're not really, your brain is still organizing, particularly the higher parts of your brain. They're present and they're doing baby things, but they're not yet fully mature and organized. And they're waiting for incoming input from lower parts of the brain to tell them how to organize. And so what happens is if you have trauma, if you have traumatic experiences early in those first 2 months of life, or if you have chaos, unpredictability, distress, things that cause what we call sensitization, those systems down here become overactive and then they become overly reactive. So what happens is over the period of time that the brain is going to be developing for the next 4, 5, 6, 7 years, rather than getting smooth, normal input from these lower systems, they're getting sort of herky-jerky, discombobulated, overactive, overly reactive input. And that causes a scrambling of all of the normal developmental processes. And so that's our interpretation. We think that's the mechanism that's involved. Now, the counter of that is, if early in life, when these systems are organizing and they get what we call a resilience building pattern of activation, which is basically there's activation of the stress response, but then it's moderate. And then when the baby cries out, the caregivers are present and responsive, and then that gets regulated. And so because they're getting that attuned, attentive, responsive caregiving in the first 2 months, they're literally imprinting into these neurobiological networks and this capacity to demonstrate resilience in the face of future significant stressors. So when the world falls apart after they're 2 or 3, 4 or 5 months old, they've got the regulatory capabilities to manage that without becoming unraveled. And so that's why we think that those systems are kind of central to that observation.
Yeah, no, it's really powerful. We received a lot of questions about this. So one, I'm going to read from Melissa. What advice do you have for people considering adopting an older child who has experienced early trauma? And I will say, in the backdrop of her question, we received lots of interest in, like, gosh, what if I come to know my child later in life, right? And does that mean doom and gloom? And, we did get a lot of that. So how do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I want people to feel hopeful. One of the things that we know about the brain, and we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, is that despite all kinds of sort of things that can happen, the brain has the capacity to continue to be malleable and changeable, and can most of the time restore healthy functioning.
Right.
So there's always reason to be hopeful. One of the reasons that we struggle with this so often, and I don't mean to be critical of our educational or mental health approach necessarily, but we tend to both educate and treat children based upon their age. So if you have a 10-year-old child, you want them to act like they're 10. But if they've had developmental trauma, they're likely to be able to have 10-year-old motor skills, but 4-year-old social skills and 2-year-old regulatory skills. And so they can't act their age. Mm-hmm. But the adult world expects them to act their age. And so rather than actually meeting them where they are developmentally and helping them catch up, we frequently unintentionally create expectations that are greater than they can meet, leading to more failure and more disconnection. So that's kind of what this neurosequential approach is, that we're just try to look at reconstruct a child's developmental history, look at their current functioning, and try to figure out what's the sequence mm-hmm. and sort of experiences that we should provide for this child right now.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, we do things that are out of sync with their chronological age, mm-hmm. but it ends up having some positive impact.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Another question that came in is from Beverly. How do we reframe trauma for the general public so that they have more empathy and understanding of trauma? And I will say, for me, when I hear you use the term like being more brain aware, to me, that builds empathy, like thinking about, what happened to that person that they react in this way or that way. But the general public, maybe, who's, are not brain scientists or who have not, studied brain development or developmental psychology and such maybe don't go there. So how do we, or how do you suggest that we really reframe trauma for a general audience so that people can, develop empathy, understanding, compassion, even for others?
I think one of the biggest challenges of our work in the last 30 years has really been trying to do that kind of thing, Melissa, is help people connect to some of these concepts in ways that are contextual to them. And when we do that, we're able to communicate these concepts a lot better. So we have people that are in law enforcement, the military, the corporate sector, folks that would not conventionally be that sympathetic towards that touchy-feely abuse excuse. There's a lot of different ways it's been framed in those worlds. But once we help them understand a little bit about stress and, think of scenarios or situations in their work where this is at play, they immediately get it. Yeah. And that's been the key, is to just basically get to know the person or the group you're talking with. And you can almost always find some sort of little thread of connection to these concepts. Yeah. That once they start to connect the dots, then a lot of these people that, I think I wrote in one of the first books I wrote with Maya Salovitz, we did all this work with these kids that were after the Branch Davidian mess. Mm-hmm. And one of the people that was originally sort of, I don't want to say anti-psychology, but he wasn't Mr. Sensitive. He was a Texas Ranger, and he wanted to know what a long-haired, hippie-looking doctor was doing in charge of these kids. And anyway, so, after I talked to him a little bit and helped him understand stress, and then stress in context of his work, he became a huge proponent of this stuff. And I think that's the key. If you can just get, in a real way, it's kind of like getting to know what their story is, Yeah.
Yeah.
And once we do that, then you can point out, well, that's kind of what we in my field call trauma.
Yeah. Right.
And so.
Yeah, no, I think in this field, I would say child abuse prevention field or home visitation or, others that are likely on this call today, we talk about the power of storytelling, right? And we talk about the power of, relationships and communicating, sort of the universals, right? Of like all parents are trying to do the very best job that they can, right? And it's because of their own experiences, their own brain development, their own life experiences that, their trajectories are different, right? But I think at the core, there are some unifying things. And I think, being a parent during this time, again, of like a global pandemic, you don't know what there's like no right answer. There's no perfect thing. Like, should I send my kids to school and risk physical health issues? Should I keep them physically distant and socially distant, because that's kind of, what has been happening. So then we say the power of social connectedness while remaining physically distant. And to be honest, the messaging, the communications, the stress, it has just been, I think, overwhelming, but I also think pretty unifying, we have been developing empathy for one another. We have been able, for some people, using this context and the stressor of this time to like understand someone else's perspective in a way that maybe we were too busy, or we use busyness as an excuse or whatever to do. But I think that that's really powerful. And there's a lot of opportunity in really, finding that, connection and that context that you described.
I think, your point about this shared experience providing a lot more opportunities to easily sort of help people connect with the experience of living with unpredictability and stress, and in some cases trauma. And I think it's we've found it easier to connect with certain groups or certain people when we can help them connect to their experience in the pandemic.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
I have to say, though, that there are still individuals who are like, you have to explain that I wouldn't consider it traumatic that
Right.
you couldn't get your hair cut. It's
Correct.
like, it's like, that's,
Yeah.
the guy down the street that lost his job and can't pay his rent. That's much more in that category, in my opinion. So
Yeah.
again, this is but it does lend opportunities to talk about that levels of
Yeah.
stress, distress, and then into uncontrollability.
Yeah.
This still is a huge area of, I don't want to say controversy, but different people in our field talk about these things very differently, using different language.
Mhm.
And people, I know that it's popular to use the term toxic stress. I don't use that
Right.
because I came from the neurosciences, where toxic actually means death. I mean, it has a specific meaning in neuropharmacology. So I avoid that. I certainly understand why people connect to that and why it's been used, but it's an example of how, in a young field, and our field is young,
Mhm.
that there's always going to be language communication confusion for a while until
Yeah.
things really get sorted out.
Yeah, I agree. And it's something that I know that through our networks, our HFA affiliates and our PCA chapters and all of our partners, we're trying to do a lot better, at least in consistent messaging of the prevention possibility, the prevention impacts, the prevention solutions, but we have a way to go. And I think part of it is because, if I'm being honest, it's because, people want their model or their program or their solution, right, to be elevated, to be funded. And a lot of that is because of how we make funding decisions in this country, right? And it's like, you better show impacts during the granting cycle. And even if the program has good impacts, when the money goes away, the program's not sustainable, versus what we really need, what I believe we really need is a culture shift, right? We need a narrative shift. We need to be talking about, how a comprehensive approach where it's, we can't just program our way out of these problems. We need to all rally and recognize that we need to assure the conditions in which people can be healthy and can be available and to their children and can be supported and in their communities and have access to all the good stuff, right? The benches, but the programs, the supports, so we have a way to go, but I think there's tremendous opportunity. And one of the great analogies I've heard in this time is someone I don't remember who said it, but I really like it, that, maybe we were all in the same storm. And maybe this resonates with me because I'm from Miami, so I've lived through many hurricanes, and such, but, maybe we're all in the same storm, but some of us were in like a yacht, right? And some of us like had no boat and we were swimming and trying to stay afloat. But the storm, did introduce chaos and disruption and unpredictability and inconsistency to a lot of people who maybe don't usually experience that, right? Or they're not conscious of experiencing it. So it's really, I think, just like you use the term, I wrote it down. Where did I write it down? Inflection points. I think it's too about these like moments that we, at least have some basic common ground to like start from that can be helpful to communicate some of these things.
No, I think you're absolutely right about that.
Olivia, I would love the third clip. I think it fits in really nicely here.
Most people who are in the process of excavating the reasons they do what they do are met at some point with resistance. You're blaming the past. Your past is not an excuse. This is true. Your past is not an excuse, but it is an explanation, offering insight into the questions so many of us ask ourselves. Why do I behave the way I behave? Why do I feel the way I do? For me, there is no doubt that our strengths, vulnerabilities, and unique responses are an expression of what happened to us. Very often, what happened takes years to reveal itself. It takes courage to confront our actions peel back the layers of trauma in our lives and expose the raw truth of our past. But this is where healing begins. Oprah.
There's music on that book?
There is. There is.
Oh, geez.
And at the end of each of your segments, it says your name, and it's
Oh, really?
yeah. So
I probably should listen to that at some point.
it's really, there's something about listening to you all speak through this and give examples from your own experiences or aha moments, to use some of Oprah's famous language, that really brings it in. But I really love what she says in that clip, because we hear it a lot, like, oh, your past is not an excuse, or, I think it's someone in the chat, although there's like hundreds of comments, I can't keep up with all of them, but, someone in the chat mentioned like, well, now I don't even remember, but the point is that your past is not your destiny, right? And we talk about this in ACEs a lot. Adverse childhood experiences are not destiny. It's some information, about what you may have experienced. But sometimes, when we talk so much about healing and resilience and hope and overcoming trauma, sometimes it can diminish. And this is, I think, what was in the chat. It can diminish how traumatic trauma is, right? Or how disruptive, or how breaking it is. So tell me a little, I would love your reactions around, trauma versus healing, and trauma on the road to healing.
Yeah, it's interesting that I've been involved in a lot of big sort of community, high profile traumatic events. And one of the things, and I write it about a little bit in this book, one of the things I see a lot is that the intensity of the pain is so overwhelming at times that people flee from it. And it a lot of times people will use the hopefulness of healing, or let's not focus on these poor kids being traumatized. Let's focus on their resilience. And it's like, well, that's great, but you have to, resilience isn't a class you take in fifth grade. It's like, it's so, but people talk about it like that. They talk about, oh, well, let's just do resilience. Okay. So I think it's a very hard thing to do. What if you're going to work with people who are impacted by chaos, threat, trauma, marginalization? You're going to have to learn how to stand in pain and experience discomfort, and not overreact with misplaced rage, and own your own stuff. You do get to get in your car and drive out of this neighborhood and go to a nice house at the end of the day. They have to go back to their crime-ridden neighborhood, to a crappy apartment that the landlord doesn't keep up. So this is a hard space. It eats up a lot of people who do this kind of work. For self-protection purposes, people will burn themselves to a nub, and then they'll go sell insurance, and they'll leave social work, or they have to. They haven't been able to get organizational support, and their self-care model is inadequate to overcome a system that's not helping them, and then all the other problems they face. And so I think that there's a lot of things about the working in the prevention and trauma arena that we're going to have to get better at. One of the key things I think is I don't think that we can continue to ask individuals to bear all of this process, all the healing, all the assessment, all the education. And that's kind of what has happened. You'll find one individual at a university who decides to go and study this and be specialized in it clinically, and maybe build a little specialty clinic. And but our systems are not organizing themselves in a way that's truly going to be responsive to these big problems. And I think that's something that we need to focus on and be better at.
I think you're absolutely right. While you were speaking, I was thinking of something that I've heard our friend, Reverend Daryl Armstrong say. He says, if you don't deal with your stuff is going to deal with you. Which I think, we kind of understand the science behind that. But there are so many of these problems that a parent or a child or whatever cannot excavate themselves from on their own, right? And it's back to sort of the conditions, the systems, the systemic racism, all the things that are the root causes, structural and social determinants of health, that it takes all of us collectively really calling for change, right? For any one particular family or, so it's more like the population level approach cannot leave all of this to like parents to solve or for kids to just develop grit. I have to tell you, resilience in general as a field, like I get like angry really, because it's
I do
like
too.
you either have it or you don't, or oh, that person has grit, and it's like, no, like this is something, like you said, it's not like a class you take, it's such a process. It ignores the complexity, in my opinion, of how people come to find themselves after experiencing trauma. But but at the same time having to be hopeful and having to really think about what is it that we want to create and what is it that we want to achieve, as a nation, as a world, as a, community. And then also as parents or as a family, it's sometimes very tense among people that should really like be aligned. I think there's these different factions, if you will. I don't know. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't know if you want to get me going on this, because here's part of the dilemma that we're struggling with is that we exist in a hierarchy, a power hierarchy that was created by previous generations. And systems always reflect the people that create them. And so the people who were in power to create systems were wealthy white males. And to this day, our systems, our universities, our academic institutions, all of our social service organizations have the residue and the remnants of that kind of an organization, where they centralize power. They don't give power, they don't have a distributed leadership model. They have a hierarchy where there's power at the top and there's utilization of people at the bottom who are viewed as interchangeable bits, and we'll wear them to a nub and then we'll just replace them with other low cost workers. And that's a model that is, if we use that model to try to do social services, that's insane. So somehow we have to figure out how to reinvent these healthcare, for example, and education and social services. And when there are these little moments where we see people that have been able to figure out how to have distributed leadership, how to share power, and they're incredibly productive. There's lower turnover. They don't spend as much time training. They have good outcomes, whatever they are, but they're also very vulnerable because they tend to be little pilot projects that exist within this power hierarchy. So it's an interest, it's a discussion that makes a lot of people get incredibly defensive. But it's a discussion that has to be had about how we're going to solve some of these complex problems. The existing systemic structures and the way they have disseminated and distributed power within those systems, again, it's inadequate to solve these problems. Right. And anyway, I think that and I think that one of the biggest tools that that system uses to maintain that power when it comes to trauma is to invoke grit and resilience.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's what I've seen too. And, a lot of questions came in, and I'm seeing them in the chat too, around, how should we be approaching policymakers with this tremendous science, with the tremendous opportunity that we always have early and often in a child's life? What is the hook that they need to understand that they have to be part of the solution?
I don't know. I mean, I in the book, even I gave some examples of where I've been trying to learn about healthier systems. And I think one of the challenges that we haven't really figured out as a species is that we've got sort of the biological apparatus to function well in a group of about 100 people. The Dunbar's number, it's some of you know about that, some of you don't, but basically we're genetically not organized to live in groups of 1 million. So what we do is we create subgroups and subgroups and subgroups, and then there's ways to exploit that and coalesce power. And every version of how that power has been coalesced exploits people at the bottom of the power differential. Yep. And so I'm not sure that I have a solution, but I think that we really need to think about this. We need to intentionally give away power, which is such a hard thing for anybody to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, increasingly, as you know, there's really a call, a movement even for really transforming systems like our child welfare system and other systems, and really being intentional about integrating integrating lived expertise, like people who have actually, lived and touched these systems, as opposed to what we typically do is like this top-down approach where, like you're describing. And so, but that's difficult because we're not used to doing that. We're not used to sharing power or elevating lived expertise. It's like the fancier degree you have, maybe we listen to that. But this is really about understanding, like, everyone has a role in this journey of, like, how do we transform our systems to really create the conditions that our kids need and our families need and our communities need to thrive. It's really hard.
I think Melissa and some people have sort of cued in on this. I think it's a combination of people who have power like me need to step away, and people who have been powerless but have many meaningful and important things to say need to be invited to the table and given opportunities to have voice and play a role in all of this. But it's weird. I mean, the inertia of having power, on one hand, it's very invisible. I get many calls every week, for example, to do something, to weigh in at a conference or to give a talk or to do this. And after a while, it just happens so much that I forget that people are giving me these opportunities to have influence and have voice. And I quit thinking about it as power, but it is power. Yeah. And I have had to really intentionally say, listen, no, but I want you to ask this person, or no, this is a good person to do this. Mm-hmm. And as we do that, I think that we're going to slowly change. But the truth is, I wish I knew. I don't know where we were going. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what structure would have the wisdom to maintain distributed leadership, and because I always think that there's somebody who's willing to step up and exploit that, and exploit the goodwill of others, and manipulate people to then collect power. And we see this happen all the time. all kinds of examples of where there's been efforts to disseminate, then somebody will come to the fore and exploit. I've seen this happen with the FLDS sect, for example. There was this, they didn't really disseminate power, but it was a system where as long as the person who was sort of given power or the people with power were not going to exploit the people in the system, it was actually quite nice.
Yeah.
But the moment they started to allow, somebody who was willing to exploit that power, they got into even a more destructive version of a system than others. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling. Sorry.
We're seeing a lot of support in the chat of, people with sort of traditional positions of power, listening with humility, right? As people with lived expertise and that power get elevated. So I think, I think what makes it even more difficult is that's just not how we've rolled. That's not how we've done things. And it's like any other muscle where we have to use it and practice and, really, and kind of get comfortable with discomfort, because it leads, it exposes that we're not very good at this. And then we try not to do it because it's hard, but we know we have to do it.
Well, and here's the thing, Melissa, that I think is so important. And this is why I think a developmental perspective is, we all need to have it, is that if you have a truly developmental perspective that recognizes that the route to growth and mastery involves failure after failure after failure after failure, then you don't fire somebody or get rid of that process the first time somebody makes a failure. Right. Think about it. If we had a process where we invited, previous foster carers or kids in foster care to kind of create the way foster care should work, and the first time there was a bad outcome, everybody go, "Oh, this is crazy," and then they would stop it. But we have corporations where people will drive a corporation into bankruptcy and they'll go get another job to head up another corporation. So when you have power, we let you fail. We don't care if you fail. When you don't have power, the first time you fail in our big grown-ups, system, we take your power away.
Yeah. It's so important what you're saying. And I think, you can liken it to brain development. I think about policy development, like these things are not linear. It's like there's going to be some failure and missteps and wrong steps and hurt feeling. It's going to be, it can be messy. I mean, there's so much complexity, but really, just like you said before, like, sometimes you have to stand in your pain. I think we have to stand in our discomfort and keep on trying, right? It's like we have to practice and build that muscle.
You guys are, you are working on that, right? You all in some.
Yeah, there's a big movement right now with 23 jurisdictions around the country, together with the U.S. Children's Bureau, Prevent Child Abuse America, Casey Family Programs, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, called Thriving Families, Safer Children. And it's really this national commitment to child and family well-being, like trying to figure out how do we transform these systems. At the core of Thriving Families is really race equity, and this, lived expertise being critical, not like after your intervention is developed, like have some people come and tell you how great it is. Early and often in the process, like having all different kinds of expertise represented and reflected. But again, it's not the typical way that communities have been engaged or have worked with, other community partners. We're lucky that our PCA state chapters are at the core of many of those interactions, providing some of the prevention, infrastructure, but certainly we have a way to go as a movement. We're committed to child and family well-being, but what are the, what does that look like? What are the outcomes? What have you done? So I think there's a lot to learn, but it's an exciting, I have to say, it's very filling work, because it's hard. It's harder than doing what we've always done, but we know what we've always done is not working for children and families. So it's really, putting that out there, which I think is really amazing. Let's go to the next clip, Olivia.
You sound like a talk show host. Let's go to the next clip.
Yeah, I could, I'm trying to channel my inner Oprah, but, I'm glad she's not witnessing this travesty.
Oh, she would love this.
We know that a dysregulated adult cannot regulate a dysregulated child. An exhausted, frustrated, dysregulated adult can't regulate anybody. As you point out, if you don't give back to yourself, you simply will not be effective as a teacher, a leader, a supervisor, a parent, a coach, anything. Self-care is huge. Unfortunately, many people feel some guilt about taking care of themselves. They view self-care as selfish. It's not selfish. It is essential. Remember, the major tool you have in helping others change, whether you're a parent, teacher, coach, therapist, or friend, is you. Relationships are the currency of change.
We have to take care of ourselves. This is especially important considering that so many of us are walking around with trauma or adversity in our own past. I wouldn't be who I am without my trauma. So I own it, I claim it, and by doing that, I believe I found a way to use it in service to others. Empathy, compassion, and forgiveness, these are all part of the practice that moves me forward in every decision or encounter I experience.
Yeah, I mean, right there, that's a lot. We got a lot of questions. Sia, Sue, Holly, others are asking what advice you have for those of us that are parenting with our own post-traumatic stress disorder, our own ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, our own trauma. How are we supposed to support our children, our foster children, our adoptive children, given our own histories?
Well, I think one of the most important things about that is to just be patient with yourself. Come on, let yourself off the hook. There's some weird, and I can see where it comes from. The media creates these ideas, and sort of social media creates the idea that, other parents are doing all this great stuff and you should be doing this. And the reality is parenting is exhausting, and it's messy, and it's imprecise, and you really connect one moment and the next moment you disconnect, and that's okay. So I think the key thing is give yourself a break, go easy on yourself, and then get other people involved in your parenting process. Human beings were meant for what we call allo parenting, which is basically, you look at our species for the last 150,000 years, we lived in communities where there were all kinds of adults around who would play a role in helping the children grow up. Now, obviously, the parent was the parent, but, there were other adults around who would direct you and hug you and teach you and make sure you were safe. And we just don't have that in many communities. In fact, I'd argue most communities anymore. Yeah. Even in a real sort of healthy family, you've got just, a couple of adults around,
right,
and one or more of them may be working at any given time. Mm-hmm. We've invented ourselves into a corner. And I think we need to uninvent that. I mean, honestly, one of the best things that could come out of COVID is that more people are going to work at home, and that they're going to spend more time just physically around where their kids are. It doesn't mean you have to be continually playing with them or interacting with them, but kids after a certain age, they just love to just glance over and see you sitting at your desk. Yeah, they like you there. They know that if they want to come putter in and interact with you for 20 seconds, they can do it, and then they'll wander off. But that's going to really change, I think, in a positive way, some of this stuff about the relational poverty that a lot of kids are experiencing.
Isn't it
So
something like 7 adults are needed, like to meet the needs of one child? Something like that?
it's high. You know, if you look at a hunter-gatherer clan at population equilibrium, which is kind of where the population of this planet was pretty close to the same for a long, long, long time. So all these hunter-gatherer clans were 30 to 40, 30 to 60 people, sometimes smaller. And we knew the life expectancy roughly, we knew the child mortality roughly. So you can estimate that basically if you were a child under the age of 6, there are at least 5 more mature individuals in that clan who were part of that caregiving group for you. And now we think it's a wonderful ratio if you've got one caregiver and 4 kids in an early childhood setting, and which is like, that's what, 1/20th of what our brain would prefer.
Wow. It's really, every time I think about this, I think about how, great, we often extend grace to others, but we don't often extend that same grace to ourselves, right? We put a lot of pressure on ourselves as parents, as moms, dads, grandparents, whatever. And many of us, these questions came in around, many of us don't have or didn't have a whole lot of self-care role models. Like, in the clip, you say, like, some of us think that it, makes us feel guilty if we take time for ourselves. So Amy asked specifically, like, what do you do for self-care? And what advice would you give to others working with traumatized youth or any youth, or we have our own youth, to prevent burnout?
Yeah, well, so I'm actually I'm
You're
usually
not good at
pretty
it
good.
either, are you?
I was going to say, do as I say, not as I do.
Right.
Well, the truth is, most of the time, I'm actually pretty good at self-care. Last couple of years have been miserable for a couple of reasons. But I usually spend a lot of time outdoors. And you can see these pictures in the background. I go up into Canada a couple of months a year in the summers before COVID. And I would take these long hikes, spend a lot of time outdoors. When I'm not up there, I try to, I exercise a lot. But I'm just very lucky that and this kind of goes back to understanding the pattern of stress as being either one that will make you get more resilient or a pattern that will make you more vulnerable. And I have a lot of stressful things in my life. I do a lot of things where there's stress, but I have control over it. I have control over my schedule. I choose when I work and how much I work. And that feels to me much less stressful than if somebody calls me and tells me I have to do something. So the big part of my self-care is making sure that I can manage my stressors in a way that they're moderate, predictable, and controllable.
Yeah.
And when I do that, then that lowers my global state of reactivity.
So then in that way, I mean, I appreciate you sharing your experience. And I think you acknowledged in it that, it can be a privilege, to be able to, have control over your schedule, to be able to take time off, to go travel and do whatever fills you. And so when we're, communicating out, we have heard from parents and young parents or ones who lost their job during COVID, or ones that didn't have childcare or didn't have enough, money to pay the rent and were scared that they were going to be evicted, that self-care, like, they're just trying to keep the lights on, and they're just trying to, have a meal, and all of that can make the work that we all have even more what is the word, emotional, draining. You feel like, those of us that are like in the business of trying to work with families and partner with families for prevention and to change their trajectories and all of that, what I've seen with my own team, many of them I'm sure on this call, is that then they just never stopped working because they felt the heaviness of like all the families who really couldn't. So how do we like acknowledge that for everyone, it's important for us to take time to regulate? And are there other ways that, are more accessible to everyone?
Yeah. Well, first of all, one of the things that is really important to acknowledge is that my ability to have this level of independence is absolutely a privilege. Yeah. And I recognize that my ability to be creative is related to my ability to be regulated, which is related to my ability to have control over my own time, which is a privilege. And I've talked about this before, but essentially, I really do believe that creativity, in many ways, sort of the luxury of being able to be an academic, is a form of privilege.
Yeah.
So let me just say a couple of things about one of the things that I've tried to do with people that work with me, who frequently will work too much, is that I will give them stretch assignments. I will give them things to do that they would not normally do. Now, what they don't recognize, it takes a lot of them now have figured me out, but basically what I'm doing is if I told them not to do this so much because you're burning out, they wouldn't do it.
Right.
Or they'd say, yes, I won't do anything, then they keep working.
Yeah.
So by literally taking them and giving them a completely different set of responsibilities, I basically force them to sort of move away from one kind of activity to another one.
Yeah.
And so I believe that it helps them build some skills around writing or something, or some other, or teaching. Whereas if they just kept doing, they're really good at their clinical work, but they're getting burned out.
Yeah.
So I pull them off. I distribute the type of activity.
That's a great example.
The other thing I try to do is make sure that they're aware of, and I teach them the power of regulatory moments.
Yes.
That regulatory moments can only need to be a couple minutes long. I mean, you could just get away from your desk for 2 minutes and walk. And then the power of connection, that it's important that the relational environment that you are in, if it's at work, that it's filled with positive relational opportunities. And so we in our organization, we have people that we pick because of their values and their vision and their temperament. And, if they're going to be all that other stuff, that'll come. But if they can create a relational environment that's supportive and they fit that, then that's a big part of self-care for the whole organization and for them as well.
That's right. I love this. And I love that everybody is sharing their great self-care strategies with each other in the chat. We got a lot of questions around this, around like Holly recognized that calming the nervous system is key to having access to the thinking brain. And so we have to really raise up these somatic moments and such. But isn't it true? Like, didn't you tell me one time, I've been quoting you and I hope not wrong, but didn't you tell me one time that it's better to even take 2 to 5 minute walks multiple times throughout the day than one super long walk? Like that would
Absolutely.
help. Yeah. Tell us more about that, because I found that really powerful for me.
Yeah. So the systems in your body that, as when you sit down and start working, you'll start to get increasingly dysregulated.
Yeah.
And that's because our bodies are intended to be moving all the time. So, and our bodies are also intended to be in relational connection all the time. So when you go to a conventional workstation like I have right here, where there's no people and I'm not moving, it literally taxes all of these physiological systems in my body and my brain. And I find it harder and harder and harder to stay regulated. So if I every 20 minutes take a 2-minute break and get up and walk on a treadmill or walk downstairs and say hi, or take a minute to make a phone call, that is a relational regulation or a somatosensory regulation. Those two little doses of things can basically keep me in this sort of pattern of activation that where the baseline's relatively lower. But if I think I'm being productive and I think I'm going to write, I sit there for an hour and a half. The reality is, if I looked at the productivity of the last 45 minutes, it would be about the same as 15 minutes that would occur if I'd been regulated the whole time.
Yeah.
And there have been studies that look at this with kids in school too, that if you let kids get up and have these regulatory breaks every 20 minutes, and they're only 2 minutes long, they stay in an open mind. They're open for business cognitively much longer.
Yeah.
And so that's what I try to get the folks that I work with to understand the biology so that they'll then kind of take my recommendations. A lot of times we tell people what to do without telling them why.
Right.
And once they understand why, they're like, oh, okay.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Then they go do it, which helps. So
I love this. Myself as a writer, I will say, I used to attribute it to like I was procrastinating, but I would, do like one paragraph, and then I would say, okay, I earned like
hey, you did. That's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
And then I would come back, I would reread that one paragraph and write the second, and then I would take another break. And but the truth is, it probably was just getting me back to that of rhythm.
Exactly right.
But I didn't realize that. So
that's exactly right. And I think that, I listened to a couple of people talk about how they would write, and everybody writes a little bit differently, but several of the best writers will literally, they'll write a paragraph a day.
Yeah.
And they'll spend the whole rest of the day, fishing and walking around thinking. And Hemingway always said, listen, stop writing when you still have something to write about.
Oh, interesting.
So then you go and think the whole rest of the day, you work on craft that, and you think about it. So then when you get back on the typewriter, you just type it. It's like, and then you get to the point where there's more to go, but then he would stop himself and then he would go off, and which I think is such a smart thing to do.
I think it's amazing. It reminds me, this is the other tangent portion of this conversation, but I have been trying to introduce my kids to like movies that I loved when I was young. And the one we just watched was Finding Forrester, which is like with Sean Connery, and he's like an old writer. Well, not old, but he used to write back in the day. And he takes this young boy under his wing kind of begrudgingly. And he has that exact same tactic, like, don't think about what you're going to write, just write, and see what comes up. And anyway, that really resonates with me. And I don't know, I'm like at 50% on the movies that I liked when I was young that my kids actually still like, but that one they really loved also because I think I have a budding writer in Lily, she's 12 and Ezra is 10. And because the boy, the protagonist in the movie is a basketball player, at least that resonated with him. So we were all happy and mommy got one movie night that she got to choose. So anyway. Okay, back to the book. Tracy Lansing from our team at PCA America and HFA, she is asking also about this frequency of like breaks and frequency of things, but really in some of the content that was in chapter 5 around building trust, that shorter, more frequent contacts help you build trust, and how this might relate to training for home visitation like HFA. What do you have to share in this space?
Well, there's one of the things that we know about the brain is that we sort of create a catalog of the attributes of people who we feel safe with. And though the general catalog of attributes comes from your family of origin and then your community and everything as you get older. So one of the challenges let me back up. Let me sort of clear. One of the dilemmas of the neurosociology of humans is that there's a major part of us that is seeking to belong to your group. And big parts of our brain are dedicated towards communicating and reading the intentionality of others. So it's around communication. And so part of us is always monitoring the social milieu to look for signals of acceptance from the people that you're around. Now, because historically and to this day, our major predator is other human beings, when you meet a person who's either giving you nonverbal signals of frustration, anger, hostility, it activates your stress response. Or if you meet someone who has attributes that are very different than your stored internal catalog, your brain will activate your stress response. So one of the dilemmas of a clinician or a home visitor meeting a new person, or particularly a new child, is that when all of the attributes of you get processed into the brain of that person, unless you have some attributes that are familiar, their brain is going to activate the stress response, which will shut down their cortex, which means that anything that's stored up in their cortex is going to be harder to access, and they're going to interact with you in a more, if you will, emotional rather than rational way. So one of the things that I do when I do consults with children who don't know me from Adam,
Right.
And I do this whether it's a consult in a hospital or doing, other kinds of work. I go in and I introduce myself, and I tell them who I am, and I tell them why I'm there, and I tell them what I would like to do, and then I give them, remind them that I can't get anything out of their brain that they don't want to give me.
Yeah.
And they have to decide whether or not they trust me and to talk with me. And I'm going to go away and let you think about it.
Yeah.
And give them control. I'm giving them control. I'm more familiar.
Yep.
They know what to expect. I'm giving them control. These are all three things that make anybody feel more comfortable. And so now the second thing is that there's a part of your brain that sort of starts to store these attributes of safe and familiar people. And because of the way the brain works, it only needs a tiny little dose of that, of you, to start to make that memory.
Yep.
So if you come back in for another 2 minutes and activate that sort of part of their brain again, and then leave and come back again for 2 minutes and come back again for 2 minutes. If you do that 4 times in an hour, they will make a real memory and store you in their brain as a familiar person.
It's so awesome because you also said, I'm coming back in 2 minutes, and you came. So they know that they can trust you. You did what you said you were going to do, right? You really set that up for them.
Right.
It's really powerful.
It's such a nice and easy thing to do, and it really approximates a more natural form of adult to child interaction. Sure. I mean, how often, and think about your family reunion, right? Where everybody's running around and kids here and there. How often does one of these kids go off with grandpa and sit with grandpa and talk for 45 minutes? It just doesn't happen, right? They come over for a minute and you go, hey, you doing well in school? You listen to the teacher? Yeah. Oh, you're in 4th grade? Wait, what do you mean you're in 3rd grade? I thought you were in 4th grade. Then they run off. That's it.
That's it.
And then they come back, and then grandpa tells them a story and they all laugh at his funny story. So they come in and it approximates a natural relational interactions. And so when you do that kind of thing with a child that you will ultimately want to do an emotionally difficult task with, you can quickly establish a sense of connection and trust that doesn't require that they come back to your office every Wednesday at 4 for 4 weeks in a row before they
Right.
finally will disclose.
Right. Right.
So,
I mean, so much about relationships is this trust component, right? And
yeah,
we all know this if we were trained in any kind of clinical discipline, right? It's like you have to establish rapport, you have to build trust. But again, because of how things are paid for and clinical interactions and reimbursements and all of that, you maybe only get what you get. And how can we, in those parameters, still employ some of these strategies that are good for the brain, good for the relationship, good for ultimately, the healing and thriving?
Melissa, one of the things that we've done is even before COVID, we would have very brief introductory Zoom meetings.
Mm.
And we'd say, hey, this is, I'm going to meet you. I just wanted to say hi.
Yeah.
I want you, we're going to get to know each other. And if I'll come by and see you in a couple more days by Zoom. And if you have any questions, just write them down and I'll answer them.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you some questions. You can ask me some questions. And you just have these little doses of contact. And it's unbelievable how quickly a child will become conversational and anticipate your visit. They want to interact with you.
Yeah. I love that. It reminds me of something that's just happened in my own family. Like last week, we started school on Wednesday, and my son is 10, Ezra, and he started middle school. And so, of course, in middle school, he has like 8 teachers or something, really different than elementary school. During COVID, thankfully, with 2 masks on and, everybody's masked and stuff, but then you're not getting a lot of the normal inputs that you get, facial expressions, et cetera. So they had sort of like a meet and greet where all the teachers could just say hello and just, and pretty much that was it the first day, between lunch and where's your room and whatever, that was the learning that happened that day. So of course I come, I pick him up and I'm like, oh, so tell me about your teachers. He's like, well, I really like my math teacher. Oh, tell me what you like. He says, she was so enthusiastic. And that's the word he used. And I thought it was hilarious because I was thinking, what did this woman do with this mask on, with her, she must have been really using like a lot of great intonation and vibe and, pointing and storytelling and all of this to really engage Ezra. He's hard to engage, like, food, fun, and friends. That's what Ezra likes. So and so it's even just that small, like getting to know her, even though math is not his favorite subject, math is not something that he's like now, oh, I get to go back to that teacher. So it just shows me like a real world example, even in this time of like, not having all the normal stimuli and inputs that our brain usually gets. We usually learn from, how did the person look and like, whatever. But even still, like kids, and this is that my kid is able to like verbalize like what it is, but that she was enthusiastic. I just loved it because also I was thinking that's me and him, because my husband would probably not resonate with as enthusiastic of a teacher as I probably would like. So, okay, now there were some fun questions that came in. So I want to intentionally shift our last 15, 20 minutes here to some of the fun things that came in. First of all, most of us, I'm sure, that are on here, were also able to participate when you had that book conversation, you, Oprah, and Kristen Bell and Dax Shepard. So we were so happy that you gave Prevent Child Abuse America and Child Abuse Prevention Month a big shout out. So we're just so thankful. And it was awesome to see like our again, fan club, right? We were all wearing our shirts with your picture and all of that through the thing. So one great question that we got was from Jennifer Jones on my team. She says, did you get to hang out with Dax Shepard after the book club conversation with you and Kristen Bell? Because you guys seemed like friends. Tell us more about that.
No, I didn't, but I had somebody when I go to LA, I'm supposed to look him up.
Yeah.
So,
we really
which
can
is kind
see
of, which I won't.
You should though.
I'm too shy. I'm too shy.
Tell us about that whole book tour, like, those virtual conversations and such. That was a whirlwind, right?
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I mean, you know me pretty well. when I'm in a smaller group and I'm comfortable and I'm talking about the stuff that I care about, I think I'm pretty socially appropriate. Well, I would, well,
You are.
maybe.
You
Yeah,
are.
okay. um, but I'm actually very shy. So in a big group, I tend to like just not talk much and just kind of watch. And so this whole thing with Oprah, she's just got the world, she knows everybody. And she pulled me into all kinds of these really interesting conversations. And I met some interesting people, but I just was so out of my water, I just am not. No, the funniest thing is, I don't know if you guys, probably shouldn't confess this, but I did like 15 or 20 of these podcast things. I think I wore the same shirt for almost every one. I have a shirt hanging in my office that every time I do something that's adult-like, I put it on. And
Funny.
That's
That's funny. It's kind of like your uniform. I like it.
It's my uniform.
Yeah. Well,
So,
people are, again, in the chat saying how much they love you, how, you're so humble, you're so adorable, all of this. So those are all kudos to you. But I just, there's also a lot of questions that came in around like, will there be a sequel to this book? Like, will there be a movie? Will there be, what else is coming?
Well, one of the things you mentioned earlier, that, we're storytelling creatures, and it's probably the most effective way to disseminate information. And so Oprah and I have been talking about that a lot. And, she was involved in, and really it was the executive producer of this series by Apple about mental health issues and destigmatizing mental health. And that is out on Apple, and it did pretty well. But I've been talking with her, and I don't know if where it will go, but I think that there are a lot of people who are becoming increasingly aware of these issues, and they want to share information. And I keep telling them about the successful public health project that was conducted around HIV/AIDS, when a bunch of Hollywood screenwriters and story runners decided that they were going to integrate those concepts into soap operas, films, TV dramas, and so forth. And I think we're going to do the same thing. We're going to get together a bunch of people that write for television and movies, and help them put together storylines around trauma and early childhood and that kind of thing.
I love that. It's something that even internally at PCA America, we're talking about and trying to navigate, just spotlighting these issues on TV.
Yeah.
There's so many programs that are even set here in Chicago. Why can't we highlight like the important prevention work that's also happening in Chicago? I love that. Timothy asks, are there specific areas of research that you want to explore more since writing this book and having these conversations with Oprah around trauma? For the last 30 years, you've been having these conversations, but are there areas for further exploration?
Well, one of the areas that we've been focusing on a lot recently is well, let me back up a second. Some of you probably know this, but I spent the first third of my career mostly focusing on understanding what were some of the mechanisms that were related to early life neglect and trauma. And so that's where a lot of the neurobiology of stress and neglect, and that's what we looked at. And that narrative is being pursued by lots of really good investigators currently. And then we became really interested in what's the counterbalancing set of experiences that are attenuating or protective. And that's where we got into the relational health stuff. And so now one of the things that we're looking at is kind of the neurobiology of connectedness. In part because we really view that as one of the more actionable elements that we have. You can see a child who's 10, 15, and you can retrospectively look at all the terrible things that have happened, and that's explanatory frequently. But what do you do with that? How do you actually begin to help somebody heal and get back on a healthier developmental trajectory? And really, as we've looked at this over the years, again and again and again and again, we come up against relationships.
Yep.
No surprise to anybody who does this work.
Right.
So we're trying to figure out the timing of this. What are the is there something about the quality of a relationship? Is there something about, are there ways to have a relational, to sort of figure out the secret sauce, so
Yeah.
to speak,
Right.
so that we can then be more intentional about rolling it out? Now, I think one of elements of the secret sauce is what you guys do in Prevent Child Abuse America and home visiting.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, even based on what we talked about earlier, part of the secret sauce is the timing.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the amount of effort put into creating safe, stable environments for young parents and their children is, even for a relatively short period of that child's life, that's a huge bang for your buck, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this graphic. There's the graphic by I'm gonna forget her name on the spot, Judy Cameron, from Harvard Center of the Developing Child, that just shows like the balance, and it shows like you have good stuff, you have bad stuff, right? And then but it's really also that fulcrum, like not everybody needs as many good things or bad, right? So it's this complexity. And I think that's a nice visual, at least for me in my brain, to get it right. But I love this where, most of our data, and this is brain data, but also just like most of our data and our messaging is really from a risk reduction or from a deficits model, as opposed to like, what are the strengths? And then what's the data to support like the power of that connection, those connectivity points, the relationships. So that's exciting work.
Yeah. And it's complex. And it's so interesting. The first time about 20 years ago, we started to get interested in this. We started to look for metrics that measured, number and quality of relational interactions. There was nothing.
No.
And we're like, wow. So we had to make up a bunch of stuff. We did stuff that was as simple as having the child write down the number of people he'd spoken to in the last 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did another thing that was like, how many people did you have a conversation with in the last 4 days?
Right.
And, some kids would sort of think, and they'd do this, and they do this, and they'd write a whole bunch of stuff. Some kids literally wouldn't write nothing. And there was a linear correlation between the symptoms that they were scored as they came in and the number of these sort of relational conversational things. Now that was just sort of a crude indicator, but it was something that we're like, wow, we have to figure out how are we going to capture some of this stuff? And we're still playing around with that. But
such power in that. And I guess we had so many questions come in around policy that I feel compelled to try to end there a little. Carrie asked, would you share the top 3 policy changes you would make to prevent trauma? And she suggested, I don't know if it's a she, but Carrie suggested family leave or teaching early childhood development, a living wage, others, but there were lots of ones around education policy. How do we connect with, legislators? How can collectively we help educate decision makers about the importance of this topic? So any reflections you have in the policy space? Oh, Carrie Sipp from Paces Connection. I figured it was you, Carrie, and then she, but I didn't know.
Well, policy is kind of a confusing thing for me. And I think in the long run, policy flows out of sort of the body of knowledge and experience of the people in power. And so that means that somehow we have to, those people in power need to be informed and educated and invested in these ideas. And usually that means either they were educated early in their lives, so it was part of their traditional educational process, or they had some personal experience that they, the topic had meaning for them. They adopted a child, or they had, saw some evidence that early childhood experience had bad outcomes. So what I think, actually, one of the things that has to happen is really the two main areas of sort of broad systemic change around concepts and beliefs are formal public education. So I think we need to integrate this content feather it into what we teach children. They need to learn about fundamentals about how the brain works, fundamentals of attachment, fundamentals of just sort of, the state-dependent functioning, which is really an essential piece of information for everybody, no matter what your walk of life. So that's one area. The other area is what I mentioned earlier, that are the most rapid, the quickest way to change public opinion and educate the public is through our entertainment media. We're storytelling creatures. So if we get this content into those arenas, and again, I'm not against documentaries, but we need to get them into cartoons, into all of the bombarded sort of narratives that are out there. And I think that ultimately, when those two things happen, then the people that emerge from those will start to make better policy. I'm not sure that we're going to be that great at sort of grabbing an 85-year-old gray-haired white man like me and saying, I want you to, go for reinventing child welfare policy. Maybe a little bit, but I think this is a transgenerational problem-solving process. And I think we need to go for the long game. If we play the long game, we're going to win. If we play the short game, we're going to lose. And we've been losing because we've been playing the short game.
That's right. Always, in every way, in our investments, how we make investments. I think, adding on to all the good stuff you said, I think we have to be investing in a generation of children and families, right? We can't just make our small short-term investments and then we have all the downstream costs that we've always had. So I think there's the urgency of this moment of, again, being alive in this moment, and being creative and being connected and, developing new partners. We are in it for the long game. And we do that by really having an intentional changing of the narrative in this country, right? What it means, like back to just the science, that it's not, one or two caregivers that can meet every need that the family has, right? We need all of us. We need each other. We all have a role to play in assuring health and well-being of all children, and that, my children will do better if all of our children are doing better, and really raising awareness there. I think Hollywood, The Hill, I think things, just this has been the most tremendous almost 2 hours together. And I just want to thank everybody that's joined us. I know there's many other people that, we're eager to get the recording. You'll have the recording for 30 days. Thank you, Dr. Perry, for making that available to everybody. But we are just so thrilled to have you as such a champion, such a pioneer in this area, but also such a humble listener, such just a tremendous force. And we are just so thankful to know you and to get to spend this time with you, Dr. Perry.
Well, Melissa, the feeling is mutual. I appreciate the opportunity. Really is a great honor for me to be able to work with you, and PCAA is an awesome organization. And you're doing the right things. You're doing important work at the leverage point where we're going to make a big difference. So, and you are such an awesome leader.
I have.
I'm so glad that we had that conversation in that airport. That was good.
That was tremendous. Thank you. And thank you for just everything you do every day. Thank you all for everything you do every day for children and families and the way that you do it. We are so thankful for those who stuck through it till the end. I know there were so many questions we couldn't get to. I'm sorry, but I hope that you found this really full. I learned something new every time I'm able to talk to this man, and I'm just so thankful for your time and commitment. So thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
See you guys. Thank you.